rapporteur on contemporary forms of racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and what they call other forms of discrimination. Dr. Mutuma Rutere. Let me start by first asking you to map out in the world how serious is the problem of racism, which and what are its manifestations, bring down to different contexts, Kenya, Africa, and the globe.
Thank you, David. The reason why my title actually talks about contemporary forms of racism is because there's a recognition that the old forms of racism seem to have disappeared. Very few countries have legislation saying on the basis of race you are not allowed to go to school. But we see a more subtle and more contemporary forms of racism in the form of, say, legislation that has the effect of discriminating certain groups. Take, for example, differences in sentencing, where you focus on you have higher sentences for a certain offense that predominantly is committed by certain racial group. And this has been raised, for instance, in the United States with regard to crack cocaine, and as opposed to the more refined form of cocaine, which is used by the whites. The crack cocaine has higher sentences used by blacks. So the effect of that becomes higher sentence rates, longer prison sentences for blacks as opposed to white people. Globally, also in other parts of the world, you, for instance, see less attention in certain areas with regard to resources available for education. Again, that may not have direct form of legal or discrimination through law, but in terms of where the focus is in the resources, the effect is that you have differential outcomes for different racial groups.
Yes.
You have all seen the problems of racism with regard to sports. Sports arenas all over the world, particularly in Europe.
Yes.
There's a lot of racial hostility to players who happen to be black. In the context of terrorism and counterterrorism, there's a lot of hostility to people who sound Muslim or who look Arabic. So law enforcement officials sometimes profile these individuals in airports, in policing operations, stop and search. UK, New York, they have been doing a lot of studies now on stop and searches by the police.
Yes.
And you can see
you
the
have found that
differences
in those stop and searches at airports, there is racial profiling.
There is no doubt about it. There's a lot of racial profiling. We have a specific case in Spain, for instance, that went up to the European Court of Human Rights. But all over in almost all the countries, we have a serious problem of racial profiling or profiling on the basis of religious identity.
Yeah, we mentioned something, profiling on the basis of religion. I mean, we have seen terrorism hugely associated with Islam. How is this, featuring globally in terms of how people who profess the Islamic faith are being treated, say in transit or in transportation points?
Well, this is a huge problem. It is true that it is also a question that many governments have picked up in terms of trying to train law enforcement officials and immigration officials, but still it is a huge problem. I see it myself when I travel.
Really?
Many times. I see people who look a certain way called aside. I am called aside myself sometimes. And only when I tell them that actually I'm the special rapporteur on racism, and you can see a kind of different treatment. But I see it every day in all the airports all over the world.
How are you able to cover the world?
Well, yeah, that is one of the difficulties with regard to the work of the special rapporteurs in the UN. We have very few staff, but we cover the world because we partner with various UN agencies that have information.
So when you are a rapporteur, you have an office with the staff?
I have staff in Geneva.
You have staff in Geneva?
Based in Geneva, not here in Kenya. But I live here, I'm based here in Nairobi.
So if you have staff in Geneva, and you have told me you are volunteering, how does that work? How do you earn your living?
Well, you're supposed to, it's like in the Bible. Remember the Bible, they said that, Paul said that people who commit themselves to the work of the Lord should have other forms of income. Paul himself was a tent maker. So it's the same model. You are living elsewhere, but you do this work because it's important for humanity. So I run a research center here in Kenya.
How are you able to do that, to do your research center and then travel through the world looking for racism?
Well, that is one of the mysteries. We are always grappling with the time. So yes, it's a big challenge.
Let's say you just presented your report to the UN
Human Rights Council.
Human Rights Council. What are the highlights of this report? What are your findings for the last term? Did it cover 1 year?
1 year.
Yes. What are the highlights of this report for people who may not have access to it?
My focus this year, David, was on the question of racism and ethnic hatred on the internet and social media. In this country, we know it's a big issue, but it's also a big issue globally. And what we are seeing is the exploitation of the internet to promote racial and ethnic discrimination, to propagate hate, to incite violence against racial and ethnic minorities, migrants, asylum seekers. But also what I was highlighting is some of the very good practices in terms of combating these problems. The use of technological measures, for instance, by internet companies themselves to filter certain content. The use of regulatory measures where, for instance, you have certain guidelines on what content can or cannot be disseminated. The use of criminal as well as administrative law to enforce the removal of certain content, but also to punish certain forms of speech on the internet.
Right.
But all this, my proposal is that needs to be done within a framework of human rights.
Human rights. Well, there have been occasions when content perceived to be discriminatory or hate speech has been knocked off, removed from the internet. Are there sufficient mechanisms in your study to control propagation of ethnic hatred or racism online? Because it is massive, as you say.
It's a big challenge, even within law, because as you very well know, the internet crosses many legal jurisdictions. So even if you wanted to prosecute in one, to remove content within one legal jurisdiction, many of these websites are probably based in the US. France, for instance, in a famous case regarding Yahoo, trying to block content that was selling Nazi memorabilia on Yahoo sites. But the website, Yahoo, is based in the US. And Yahoo went to court on the basis of that you cannot regulate Yahoo through French law. Now, they were not able to enforce that through law, but what you've seen now is that sites like Yahoo and Google have customized their search engines in such a way, for instance, in countries that block certain forms of content, you cannot access it. So where you can search a lot of stuff on the denial of Holocaust in the US, you'll not be able to search in places like Austria or France because using the local Google search engines. And these are some of the interesting measures that can be done. But also there are cases where it is important to criminally charge individuals who incite violence through the use of the internet. That's acceptable and important.
Has that happened here?
Well, we have some interest.
In your study local.
Yeah, we have some interesting cases which we all know about that are ongoing now in court with regard to Facebook postings and other people who are posted on their blogs. We've not had a conclusive statement on the law by the High Court, as far as I know, with regard to hate speech or incitement through the use of the internet. And we are all waiting to see how the courts are going to rule on these cases, because it's going to set some very interesting framework on how to regulate content on the internet. But I believe...
Isn't it very difficult, really, to determine, given this is the age of freedom, so to speak, the age of rights, to draw a line on what you would call xenophobic or racist, and what would be legitimate expression, which should be guaranteed and fundamental.
I agree, and that's the danger in a very blanket form of censorship that is not very, very tight. We need, in my view, very, very tight legislation, and I think our legislation, the National Cohesion and Integration Act, is not a very good piece of legislation. It could be tightened to ensure that you capture the small category of speech that is not protected. Now, everyone will agree that speech that advocates genocide against a certain group is not protected speech.
Yes. But
so we need to focus on a very small category. But then whether the objective statement constitutes an offense can only be determined by a court of law.
Now, you have written a report which you have taken to the United Nations.
Yes.
What is the impact of that report?
Well, the impact of this report is that part of my mandate is to advise member states of the United Nations on some of the good practices on what they can do. And states are very keen on hearing the good practices. My report has a lengthy section on good practices on how to combat racism and ethnic discrimination on the internet. So states do pick this up. States pay a lot of attention to these forms of report. They read these reports line by line, and we've seen them picking up on some of the recommendations. When other mandate holders, other special rapporteurs also visit countries, or when I visit countries, I also pick up on these recommendations to assess the extent to which the states
I remember there was
can your advice be ignored?
Yes, of course. When you advise, it doesn't mean that people will take all the advice. It can be ignored, and in many cases, in some cases, states don't actually into the advice.
You remember the case of the UN rapporteur on torture, who came here and gave a report touching on the Oscar Foundation and all this, and it caused quite an uproar. So it's I mean, which is pertinent to what Mutegi is asking. Do governments take reports of UN rapporteurs seriously, or they are again just cosmetic things that they read and they put aside, and there are no consequences to ignoring those recommendations and findings?
Well, I think the case you point is actually a very good case to show that actually states take this seriously. Otherwise, they would have ignored it. But what did the Kenyan states do? They engaged the rapporteur. They did not agree with many of the issues that he raised. But eventually, you've seen progress on some of the issues that the rapporteur had actually recommended. Right. We actually saw action on that. There was one who was here in the late 1990s, Sir Nigel Rondley. He made some recommendations that the government even they did not like, but eventually we saw some action on those specific issues he had recommended. So governments do take this report seriously.
Let's look at recommendations in your book, in your report that you just presented. Are you fixing or making specific recommendations about particular countries, and which are these?
No, because this is a thematic report. It's a global report. It does not make recommendations on specific countries. I only make recommendations on specific countries when I visit that country officially. But I do make specific recommendations with regard to enacting legislation, that countries need to enact legislation that criminalizes and prohibits certain forms of speech, that they need to establish mechanisms for regulation through national independent institutions like the National Cohesion. I also made recommendations on the need to invest in education, to educate the young people on the better and safer use of the internet. So it's not on specific countries, but
but there are trends that you identified in that study, right? There must be countries which there is a greater offense being committed with regard to perpetration of hate speech or racism online.
Yes.
Were there culprits that you can underline?
No, because this was not a study on specific countries, but
yes.
I have picked good practices from a number of countries.
Right.
So I've only used countries, and this is part of the practice, because for me to name culprits, I need to visit the country, engage the government, and many other actors.
So on this particular one, you didn't visit any countries, but it was a general study capturing the trends that are happening online.
Yes.
Okay, let me ask you this.
But it's also based on even conferences we held with experts from all over the world on this issue.
Right. What would you define? Because that's a very tenuous term. I mean, racism, hate speech, even in our context in Kenya, has always been very, people interpret it liberally, depending on which side you're standing. This could constitute hate speech, this might not. So what is racism? And just within the mandate, or your mandate, what exactly do you pursue or decide is racism or racist expressions?
Yes, that's a very useful question, because part of my worry is that we should not criminalize stupid statements, for instance. In a free society, stupidity should not be criminalized.
Expression, yes.
In a democracy, you must allow people to say things that you don't like. And you don't want to create a chilling effect on fair criticism against the government, because also there is a danger that in the name of trying to combat hate speech or incitement, that actually governments end up restricting the criticism against them. That should not be the basis. There needs to be criminalization of a very small, narrow category of speech. And one of these is, for instance, any speech that advocates violence against an ethnic or racial group. That is speech that needs to be criminalized.
Yes.
Any speech that advocates and promotes discrimination against a group on the basis of ethnicity or race, that is speech that should be prohibited. Any speech or advocacy, specific advocacy, that promotes war crimes or genocide or crimes against humanity, those are categories of speech that needs to be prohibited.
Right.
Now, speech also, in my view, also there needs to be a stricter and a more firm attention on the utterances by political leaders. It is different if John Doe is sitting somewhere in their basement writing something on Facebook, as opposed to a leader of a political party, an official political party, posting certain comments on the internet.
Right.
They need to be treated differently, and you ought to be more willing to punish political leaders who make this form of advocacy.
Somebody asked something very interesting. Feedback from viewers says, when you say something which is true, is it hate speech?
Well,
because people say things purporting them to be fact.
Yes.
Yeah.
But you all know that truth is often depends sometimes on who believes it's the truth.
Yes.
The truth of everyone believes that their partner is beautiful. Now the next person may not believe that. So truth is not 100% scientific.
It's not
fact.
universal.
It's not universal.
Truth is not universal.
It's not a 1 + 1 = 2, and that's what we need to understand.
Yeah.
What if you think a certain community is lazy and you think that's fact? That's not fact. That's not truth. That is subjective opinion.
That is subjective stereotypes.
Those are stereotypes.
Yes. Do they constitute hate?
Absolutely. Stereotypes and prejudices.
Yes.
And a lot of my attention in conversations with the state is also the need to combat stereotypes. And the media here plays such a major role in combating stereotypes. They need to ensure that we correct the stereotypes, we challenge the stereotypes, particularly those propagated by people in positions of influence and leadership.
Yes.
If you listen to a radio,
or
many radio stations in this country,
there's
a lot of stereotyping. In fact, all the jokes made, they are stereotypes. As certain tribes imitating and aping certain ethnic groups. What do you say about that? It's very common. It's like routine. Although it's not, maybe it's not harmful. But it's stereotype. Some of it negative.
It is true. There's a lot of stereotyping, and I would hesitate to say let's criminalize all of it and cut all those journalists to prison tomorrow. I think
some of them are not journalists, they're just comedians.
That some of them are comedians and comedy. Yeah. In fact, in my report, I pay attention to one comedian in France who has spent his time making comedy routines dismissing the Holocaust. And whereas it might be called legitimate art, it needs to be regulated in a certain way. And what I advocate for is self-regulation by the industry itself. There is need for a lot of investment by the industry itself to regulate and educate.
Because a lot of those things are done unconsciously.
Precisely.
Not with the knowledge that they constitute hate speech, or they are pejorative, they are entrenched stereotypes.
Yes.
They're for fun.
Yes.
That shouldn't be criminalized. Yes. People should not be, as you say, carted to jail because they made a joke about, okay, if you're a Luo, and that really goes around a lot of what characteristics, a standard Luo espouses, or a standard Luya or Kikuyu like that. Those should not be taken to be criminal things, should they?
No, but I think what is required is actually an evolution through education, through self-regulation of ourselves, so that we move from these crude stereotypes to a better way of making fun without necessarily crudely stereotyping individuals. Now, there are contexts where you could not make those kind of comments, because context also matters a lot. And you remember 2007 in Kenya, even some of the usual jokes we are making, that context did not allow.
Right.
And therefore we need to pay attention to the context also.
Now, okay, let me come down to our own situation local here. I mean, you and rapporteur from a country which is having a lot of issues of ethnicity. Right now, this country is tearing apart because of really ethnic tensions and issues along that. Has it not, why hasn't it occurred to you that you need to engage locally on local situation? First being a national of Kenya.
Yes. Thank you.
Or are you barred by your own protocols?
Well, no, because I am banned in a certain way, for instance, in making statements about Kenya on specific questions without first engaging through the official channels. And I have engaged the Kenyan government through the official channels on a number of questions.
Right.
But also as a citizen, David, I'm very, very much involved in a lot of conversations. I was one of the speakers at the recent Pamoja conference that was opened by the president recently.
Yes.
I am involved in very many conversations, particularly after the recent Usalama Watch, as part of groups of citizens who are working around these issues. I have engaged Kenyan officials on a lot of these questions through the work that I do. So I am very much involved as a Kenyan citizen on these conversations.
Have you paid the president a visit to discuss these issues?
I have not paid the president a visit, and to be fair, I have not requested a visit to the president.
Yes.
But I have talked to a number of other officials on these issues.
Right.
Yes.
Which means what? You are visiting Kenya?
No.
You say you visit the country.
No, I have not.
When you say you're visiting the country, what do you do?
Okay. When I say I visit a country, first I put in an official request, and then the government accepts, and then we arrange a program visit. Usually it takes about 10 days, and you meet a whole range of officials on relevant ministries. Then you also meet people in NGOs, you meet members of opposition, members of parliament, institutions such as the judiciary, and after that I prepare a report.
You think 10 days is enough to know about the country?
10 days is not enough, even a month is not enough, but 10 days usually is on average what is usually possible to engage, because remember also my mandate covers the entire globe. And I try to balance all the regions of the world in my visits.
In your visit, which is the worst country that you ever went to?
All of them have serious problems. I am banned from describing a country from the worst.
Because the worst
they all have serious problems.
They all have serious problems. Others have more serious problems, but every single country, Mutegi, has problems of racism and ethnic discrimination. I went to one country and I met the Speaker of Parliament who invited me to enjoy the country and told me they don't have problems of racism. They have no problems. Of course, they have huge problems. So one of the things that all governments say is that we don't have those problems.
Yes. Let me ask you this. How would you, okay, you haven't engaged with the Kenyan situation, but what would you, how would you describe our Kenyan context, our Kenyan situation today? Does it have grave issues, and how are they manifesting themselves? And what would be the way forward on those issues?
Yes, the Kenyan...
In the context of your mandate, racism, discrimination, racial profiling, and so forth. Are they manifest in this society?
Absolutely, absolutely. Remember, actually, my mandate is specifically focused on discrimination on basis of race, ethnic, or national origin.
Right.
Xenophobia is under my mandate. You know, the hatred and fear and different treatment of foreigners. Now, we all agree that there's a serious problem of discrimination against people who are perceived to be Somalis, for instance, in this country.
Right.
That has manifested itself, it's been in the media. And it's one of the issues that you remember the Independent Police Oversight Authority raised with regard to policing that, for instance, is perceived as targeting a specific community.
In the recent Usalama operation, did that qualify or to be called profiling? Racial profiling.
The Independent Policing Oversight Authority has raised that issue that is perceived as profiling. If you go to a certain area, for instance, as police, and that area is only a certain group lives in that area, resides in that area, and you round up a certain group on the basis of they look Somali or they look Kikuyu, then you have a serious, you have a policy that might be interpreted as profiling.
Right.
Now, I have not done a visit to Kenya, so I cannot conclusively make this determination without visiting Kenya and engaging the officials. But from what reports we have read, there's a need for concern and action with regard to perceptions of profiling. And also the ethnic problem. More broadly, David, we have a serious problem of ethnic incitement in this country. And that is something that I think everyone agrees in this country, and it's something that needs very serious attention through the use of legislation, but also through education, through leadership by political leaders themselves. We need to see disciplinary mechanisms within parties, political parties, that if David or Mutegi and is a member of my party and I'm the leader, and he said he uttered ethnically inciting statements, the party disciplines that person. This is part of what I always advocate.
That's why somebody would defend themselves and say, that is the truth. Where do you separate truth as you hold it to yourself with what is ethnically inciting? That is the whole point. Because a lot of statements that are going out from politicians or even online, social media, are justified on the basis of truth. Should truth be categorized as hate speech?
No, truth should not. But statements that paint ethnic groups with a broad brush should be categorized as speech that is not protected. It is one thing, for instance, to say David is engaged in ethnic favoritism, that in the business that David runs, he only hires people of certain ethnic groups. It is wrong to say that it is Luyas, if David is from Luya community. Luyas have taken over that company. It's Luyas are in conspiracy. Now, that's the distinction we need to make. Fair comment of analysis of say, people in a certain institution is fair comment. Labeling the an entire community as in a conspiracy or oppressing or lazy, those are lines that should not be crossed, in my view.
Is the future bright, looking at the many avenues and the way society is moving forward? many avenues for propagating what would be called racist. You know, in fact, what are the trends like? Is racism on a decline? Are forms of discrimination, xenophobia on the decline or on the increase as we globalize?
Well, there's more awareness of diversity of the world because a kid now sitting here in Nairobi knows as much of what is happening in the U.S. as a kid in the U.S. itself. So there's less feeling of distance. It's much easier now for people to integrate.
Right.
But again, these tools also of integration are fueling this. It's much easier now to organize a racist movement via the internet.
Yes.
When people, for instance, are faced with economic difficulties, like we have seen in Europe, we have seen great mobilization on the basis of race, hatred against migrants who are seen to take over their jobs. So humanity has made a lot of progress, but humanity also seems to be all the time repeating the mistakes of yesterday again and again and again, and therefore the need for constant vigilance, the need for constant education, the need for action all the time. You would imagine Europe with its history and understanding and sophistication will not have the problem of racism, but we see the problems. So it's an ongoing challenge in the world.
What about relationships? There are certain communities you can't marry from, for instance.
Yes, yes.
A boy and a girl just meet in Nairobi, they won't get married.
Yes.
Just like that, so the woman from Sudan was verified for marrying a Christian.
Yes.
Here, you trying to marry a girl from a certain race.
Yes.
Or a certain tribe.
Yes.
And it's not racism when the community refuses or the parent.
Well,
how do you deal with that?
That's a very good answer. Someone asked me in Malaysia if I don't want my daughter to be married by someone from a certain race because I don't like that race. Am I a racist? And I told him, actually, you are defining what a racist is. That even in personal relationships, prejudices against people because on the basis of race, that's the ideology of racism. The ideology that believes that certain ethnic groups are superior or are inferior than the others. Yeah. That's racism. That's what needs to be combated. And therefore, that's why we need to go beyond the law and also appeal to the mind and the hearts of individuals. Because the racist ideology and prejudices live in the minds and hearts of people. So we need to think of how do we promote inter-ethnic, interracial integration, marriages,
but
whichever.
It doesn't seem to happen here in this country, but Kenyans and the Asian community.
I think they are...
To tell the truth.
I think there are difficulties there, but and I don't have the statistics. The hope is that it's increasing as the times
which
change.
Obviously contribute to that intensification or perpetration of racism. Some of them are cultural.
Yes.
I mean, as he's citing, for example, certain cultures, don't feel people from certain cultures don't feel free to engage with others from different cultures.
Yes.
Because communities have been raised with that attitude in mind, that conservative view that it's closed.
Yes.
Caste systems and so on, I think, which contribute to us that. Let me, just as we conclude this discussion, where can your reports be found, first of all, and then secondly, as we close this, where are you next focusing in your work?
Okay, thank you. With regard to my next focus, this year for the General Assembly, I'm preparing a report on racism in sports. You know, sports is a huge, huge arena where you've seen racist sentiments and expressions. And I'm also preparing another report on profiling by the police on ethnic and racial basis in police operations. My reports, all the statements that I issue are available on the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. If you Google Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, you type in my name, you will find all the reports that I've issued, including the report that I presented to the Council last week.
Okay. All right, that's it this morning. We were looking at racism and racial profiling and other forms of discrimination, xenophobia, with the UN Special Rapporteur on racism, xenophobia, and other forms of discrimination. Thank you for watching.